Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Esther Harding, the physician of feminine mysteries. Together and apart, they explored the terrain where archetypal forces meet embodied experience, where ancient symbols become living pathways through the inner landscape. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the transformation of the psyche, one seeing universal patterns in mythology and dreams, the other discovering how those patterns breathe and move through women's particular experiences of being. Their dialogue, whether spoken in Zurich consulting rooms or across the Atlantic through letters and silence, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Esther Harding, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the year 1922, a young British physician named Esther Harding crossed the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind the hospitals and examining rooms of London for something she could not yet name. She was 35 years old, trained in the rigorous materiality of medicine, yet something in her had begun to hunger for a different kind of healing, a different understanding of what lived beneath the surface of symptoms and suffering. She had heard whispers of a Swiss psychiatrist who spoke of the soul as if it were a country one could map, who treated dreams as messages from territories deeper than conscious thought. The whispers had grown into a pull she could not resist, and so she found herself on a ship bound for Switzerland, carrying medical journals and a heart full of questions that medicine alone could not answer. Carl Jung was 47 that year, in the full complexity of his middle age. The great rupture with Freud lay nearly a decade behind him, and he had emerged from that dark night of confrontation with the unconscious, his own and the collective, with a vision of psychology that reached beyond pathology toward transformation. He had already begun to articulate his theory of psychological types, his understanding of the collective unconscious and its inhabitants, the archetypes that moved through human consciousness like gods walking in the world of mortals. His home, in Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich, had become a destination for seekers, for those who sensed that the rationalist explanations of mind offered by the dominant schools of psychology left something essential untouched. Harding arrived at Jung's door not as a patient in the conventional sense, but as a fellow physician seeking initiation into a psychology that honored what she had always sensed but never been taught to articulate. Her medical training had shown her the body's mechanisms, but in her years of practice, she had encountered again and again the mysteries that mechanism could not explain, the illnesses that reflected spiritual crises, the healing that came through meaning rather than medicine, the ways women's bodies and women's suffering seemed to speak in a language her education had not prepared her to understand. Jung saw in Harding something he recognized: the medical mind, seeking its own expansion, the rational intellect willing to court the irrational depths. He had made that journey himself, had descended into his own unconscious in the years after the break with Freud, and had returned with treasures and terrors in equal measure. He knew that the journey required not just intellectual courage, but a willingness to be transformed by what one discovered. Harding possessed both the disciplined mind of a scientist and the openness of someone who intuited that science, as she had learned it, was only one way of knowing among many. Their first conversations, we might imagine, unfolded in Jung's study, with its books lining the walls like witnesses, its windows looking out on the lake where water met sky, in that indeterminate line that mirrors the boundary between conscious and unconscious. Jung would have spoken about his recent work, about the archetypes he was beginning to understand not as mere concepts but as living presences in the psyche. He would have described the anima, that figure of the feminine in a man's psyche who mediates between ego and unconscious, who appears in dreams and fantasies as guide, seductress, sorceress, saint. The anima, he explained, carried the potential for connection to the deeper layers of being, but also the danger of possession, of being overwhelmed by the very forces meant to transform. But what about women themselves? Harding must have wondered, even in those early conversations. If the anima was man's inner feminine, what was the shape of woman's own relationship to femininity, to the archetypal feminine that moved through dreams and myths? Jung had his theories, the animus as woman's inner masculine, the collective masculine that appeared in women's dreams as opinion giver, judgment maker, the voice that connected woman to logos, to word and structure. Yet Harding's medical experience had shown her something more complex, more nuanced than a simple symmetry of inner figures. She had seen women patients whose suffering seemed connected to a severance from something deep and cyclical, something that modern life with its electric lights and scheduled hours had obscured. She had seen women torn between the demands of a patriarchal culture and the whispers of something ancient and insistent within them. She had seen how women's bodies marked time differently, how their experience of self seemed more fluid, more permeable to the tides of both inner and outer worlds. This was not pathology, she intuited, but a different kind of psychology, one that had been interpreted through masculine frameworks for so long that its own language had been nearly forgotten. Jung welcomed her not just as a student but as an analysand, and the analysis that followed would shape both their understandings of depth psychology. In the Jungian tradition, training analysis was not merely therapeutic but initiatory. It was the descent into one's own underworld, the confrontation with one's own shadows and complexes and archetypal patterns. For Harding, this descent became an exploration of what it meant to be a woman in possession of intellectual and professional authority, what it meant to carry both the physician's rational competence and the deeper knowing that rationality alone could not access. We must pause here and consider the landscape of Jung's thought in the 1920s, for it was during these years that his mature psychology truly took form. The earlier works, the word association studies, the theories of complexes, had established him in the psychiatric community. The break with Freud had forced him to forge his own path. The years of confrontation with the unconscious, recorded in what would later be published as the Red Book, had revealed to him the reality and power of archetypal forces. Now he was engaged in the work of systematizing these insights, of creating a coherent psychology that could honor both the scientific method and the numinous experiences that eluded scientific categories. Central to this emerging system was the concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into a unity that is greater than either alone. Individuation was not adjustment to social norms, but a following of an inner imperative, a becoming what one truly is, beneath the masks and adaptations that social life requires. It involved confronting the shadow, those aspects of self deemed unacceptable and thus repressed. It required recognizing and integrating the contrasexual elements of the psyche, anima for men, animus for women. And it culminated, if it culminated at all, in a relationship with the self, that organizing center of the psyche that Jung sometimes called the God image within. This was the framework Harding entered, and it spoke to something she recognized as true. Yet from the beginning, she sensed that Jung's framework, while profound, carried certain limitations. It was a psychology, developed primarily from work with male patients and from Jung's own masculine psychology. When Jung spoke of the feminine, he spoke as a man encountering the feminine within and without, spoke of it with reverence, certainly with recognition of its power and mystery, but still from the position of otherness. The feminine in Jung's psychology was what man encountered, what man integrated, what man related to as not himself. But Harding was not encountering the feminine as other. She lived within a female body, moved through the world as woman, and her psychological development was not about integrating a contrasexual opposite, but about understanding and embodying a femininity that was both personal and archetypal, both culturally constructed and deeply instinctual. This distinction would become central to her life's work, but in those early years in Zurich, it was more of a felt sense, a question that grew from her own analysis and from the clinical work she began to do as she trained in analytical psychology. Jung encouraged his students to find their own way within the framework he provided, to extend and elaborate his insights through their particular perspectives and experiences. He was not interested in creating dogmatic followers, but in fostering a community of explorers, each mapping different territories of the psyche's vast landscape. In this atmosphere of intellectual and spiritual freedom, Harding began to discover her unique contribution. After several years of study and analysis with Jung, Harding returned to London in 1925, then moved to New York in 1926, where she would spend most of the rest of her life. She established herself as one of the founding members of the Analytical Psychology Club of New York, bringing Jungian psychology to America not as a European import, but as a living practice that could take root in new soil. She maintained her correspondence with Jung throughout her life, seeking his guidance on theoretical questions and sharing her evolving insights from her own clinical work. In New York, Harding's practice attracted many women who found in analytical psychology a framework that honored their inner lives, their dreams, their sense of being moved by forces larger than ego consciousness. As Harding worked with these women, patterns began to emerge. She noticed how many of them struggled with what she came to call women's mysteries, the psychological and spiritual dimensions of menstruation, sexuality, pregnancy, motherhood, and menopause. She observed how women's identity seemed less fixed than men's, more subject to cycles and transformations, and how this fluidity could be either a source of richness or a cause of disorientation, depending on whether it was honored or pathologized. She noticed, too, how women's relationships with other women formed a crucial part of their psychological development in ways that had no direct parallel in men's psychology. The mother-daughter bond, the friendships between women, the ways women gathered in circles and shared confidences, these relational patterns seemed to carry psychological significance that went beyond personal history into something archetypal. Yet, Jung's theory, with its focus on the heterosexual pairing of masculine and feminine, had little framework for understanding the psychological importance of same-sex relationships, particularly between women. Most significantly, Harding observed that women's spiritual and psychological development often centered on a relationship with a feminine divine figure, not as anima projection, but as a direct encounter with an archetypal feminine presence. Her patients dreamed of moon goddesses, earth mothers, virgin huntresses, wise crones. They felt called to rituals that honored feminine cycles. They experienced transformation not through integration of a masculine animus, but through a descent into feminine darkness and a rebirth into feminine wisdom. These observations led Harding to begin her own research into the mythology and symbolism of the feminine divine. She studied the ancient goddesses, Ishtar and Artemis, Isis and Diana, not as mythological curiosities, but as living symbols that still move through women's psyches. She explored the moon symbolism that appeared so consistently in women's dreams and fantasies, understanding the moon as an image of feminine consciousness, cyclical rather than linear, reflective rather than self-illuminating, waxing and waning rather than constant. In 1933, Harding published her first major work, The Way of All Women, a groundbreaking exploration of feminine psychology from a Jungian perspective. The book was revolutionary in its approach. Rather than applying Jung's concepts mechanically to women's experience, Harding used women's actual experiences, their dreams, their conflicts, their developmental crises, as the starting point and then drew on Jungian theory to illuminate what she observed. The book explored what Harding called the phases of women's psychological development, which she saw as fundamentally different from men's. She described how a young woman must first emerge from identification with her personal mother, then navigate the complex terrain of her own sexuality and relationship needs, then potentially face the transformation of motherhood, and finally, in the second half of life, discover a wisdom that comes not from accumulated knowledge, but from the integration of her life's experiences into something she called the old wise woman within. Throughout the book, Harding emphasized what she termed the necessity of feminine consciousness. She argued that women had been taught to value masculine consciousness-focused, analytical, goal-oriented, at the expense of their own mode of awareness. Feminine consciousness, as Harding described it, was more diffuse, more relational, more attentive to the spaces between things than to the things themselves. It moved in spirals rather than straight lines. It knew through participation rather than observation. It valued being as much as doing. This was not a call to essentialism or a romanticization of traditional femininity. Harding was clear that the qualities she associated with feminine consciousness were archetypal capacities, not biological inevitabilities. Men could develop these qualities too, though they approached them as integration of anima. And women could develop masculine consciousness, could be analytical and focused and goal-oriented. The problem was that the culture overwhelmingly valued only one mode and denigrated the other, leaving women feeling that their natural way of being in the world was inferior, something to be overcome rather than cultivated. Jung praised The Way of All Women as an important contribution to analytical psychology. He recognized in it an extension and deepening of his own work, a willingness to question his assumptions while remaining faithful to the core insights of analytical psychology. Yet there was also, perhaps, a slight discomfort in his response. Harding was gently, but firmly, suggesting that his anima theory, while valuable, was incomplete, that it described how men experienced the feminine, but not how women experienced themselves as feminine beings. The intellectual and personal relationship between Jung and Harding in these years was one of mutual respect, complicated by the inevitable tensions that arise when a student begins to see beyond the teacher's framework. Jung had encouraged his students to develop their own perspectives, yet when they did so, particularly when they questioned his theories about gender and the psyche, he could become defensive. He was a product of his time and culture, a man of immense insight who nonetheless carried certain blind spots about women's psychology. Harding navigated this tension with remarkable grace. In her writings and in her correspondence with Jung, she maintained a stance of respectful dialogue. She affirmed the profound truth of Jung's understanding of the archetypes, of the collective unconscious, of individuation. She credited him as the source of the framework that had made her own explorations possible. Yet she also quietly insisted on her own observations and insights, especially when they diverged from Jung's theories about women. In 1935, Harding published Women's Mysteries, Ancient and Modern, the work that would establish her as one of the most important interpreters of feminine psychology in the Jungian tradition. This book was an exhaustive study of moon symbolism and goddess worship in ancient cultures, connected throughout to the psychological experiences of contemporary women. Harding argued that the ancient mysteries, the ritual practices surrounding goddesses like Ishtar, Diana, and Isis, were not merely historical curiosities, but living psychological patterns that still operated in women's psyches. The moon, Harding showed, had been universally associated with feminine divinity because it mirrored women's experiences of cyclical change, of waxing and waning, of darkness and light in alternation. The moon pulled the tides, influenced fertility, marked time in months rather than in solar years. Women's bodies followed lunar rhythms, and their psychological lives, Harding argued, were similarly cyclical. A woman was not the same person at all points in her cycle. Her energy, her mood, her way of relating to the world shifted in predictable patterns. This was not pathology, but a different kind of organization of consciousness, one that the solar bias of patriarchal culture had rendered nearly invisible. Harding described how the ancient mystery religions had provided women with rituals and symbols that honored these cycles. The descent into the underworld and return, the death and rebirth of the goddess, the sacred sexuality of the temple, these were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated psychological technologies that enabled women to navigate the transformations of their own lives with consciousness and grace. In losing these mysteries, Harding suggested modern women had lost connection to their own psychological depths. The book was controversial. Some in the analytical psychology community felt that Harding was straying too far from Jung psychology into anthropology and religious studies. Others worried that her emphasis on women's cyclical nature played into stereotypes about women's emotionality and irrationality. But for many women who read the book, it was revelatory, a permission to honor their own experiences rather than trying to force themselves into a masculine model of psychological development. Jung's response to Women's Mysteries was complex. He wrote Harding a letter praising the depth of her research and the connections she had drawn between ancient symbolism and modern psychology. He appreciated her emphasis on the archetypal dimension of women's experiences. Yet, in other contexts, he suggested that Harding might be overemphasizing the difference between masculine and feminine psychology, that the fundamental structure of individuation was the same for both sexes, even if the specific challenges differed. This disagreement, if we can call it that, since it was never stated sharply, but rather existed as a subtle divergence in emphasis, pointed to a fundamental question in depth psychology. Were the archetypal patterns that Jung had identified truly universal, operating identically in all human psyches regardless of sex? Or did embodiment matter? Did the fact of living in a male or female body, of being raised as boy or girl in a gendered culture, create fundamentally different psychological structures? Harding's answer was subtle. She agreed with Jung that certain archetypal patterns were universal: the shadow, the self, the journey of individuation. But she insisted that these universal patterns manifested differently through male and female experience. The shadow of a woman raised to be selfless and accommodating would contain different contents than the shadow of a man raised to be competitive and emotionally controlled. The self might organize itself around different archetypal images, more often the goddess for women, the wise old man for men. And individuation, while universally a journey toward wholeness, would involve different specific tasks, depending on one's embodiment and cultural conditioning. Moreover, Harding suggested, Jung's very framework carried a masculine bias that made it difficult to fully articulate feminine experience. The language of consciousness versus unconsciousness, of ego as a stable center that must be strengthened before it could be relativized, this language reflected a masculine experience of selfhood as bounded and distinct. Women's experience, she proposed, often involved a more permeable sense of self, a consciousness that was more fluid and relational from the start. This was not a problem to be solved, but a different starting point that required a somewhat different map. Let us linger here on this crucial divergence, for it illuminates something essential about the relationship between Harding and Jung. They were not opponents, but collaborators in a shared project of understanding the psyche's depths. Yet they were collaborators who saw different aspects of the territory they explored, and the difference in their perspectives had everything to do with the bodies they inhabited and the social realities they navigated. Jung was a man in an era when masculine authority went largely unquestioned. His brilliance had earned him prominence in the medical and academic worlds. His insights into the psyche were taken seriously by other men of learning. When he spoke of the anima, of man's inner feminine, he spoke with the confidence of someone describing his own inner experience and the patterns he observed in his male patients. When he spoke of women's psychology, he spoke with the same confidence. But here, his authority was more problematic, for he was describing from the outside what women lived from the inside. Harding was a woman in an era when women's intellectual authority was constantly questioned. She had fought to become a physician at a time when medicine resisted women's entrance into the profession. She had pursued depth psychology when academic psychology barely acknowledged it as legitimate. She spoke about women's psychology not as an outside observer, but as a woman who had lived the struggles and transformations she described. Her authority came not from institutional position, but from a different source, from the authenticity of lived experience interpreted through psychological insight. This difference in positioning shaped everything about their approaches. Jung could theorize about the anima and animus as complementary opposites, as masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche that must be integrated. For him, this theory had a satisfying symmetry, a wholeness that reflected the mandala-like patterns he saw as images of the self. But for Harding, working daily with women patients, the animus theory felt insufficient. Yes, women had inner masculine aspects, but the women she saw struggled less with integrating an inner masculine than with discovering and trusting their own feminine authority. Harding noticed that women often carried a negative animus that criticized and undermined them, telling them they were not smart enough, not good enough, should defer to male authority. This animus seemed less like a complementary opposite that needed integration, and more like an internalization of patriarchal devaluation of women. The work of psychological development, then, was not primarily about integrating this critical masculine voice, but about developing what Harding called inner feminine authority, a trust in one's own perceptions, feelings, and intuitions that did not need validation from external masculine sources. This inner feminine authority was not the same as the animus, though it might use animus energy once that energy had been transformed. It was something prior to and deeper than the masculine-feminine polarity Jung emphasized. It was, Harding suggested, connected to what she called the goddess within, an archetypal feminine presence that served for women something like what the self served in Jung's psychology. This goddess within was not just the integrated totality of masculine and feminine, but the feminine itself as a complete principle containing its own darkness and light, its own creating and destroying capacities. In 1938, Harding gave a series of lectures that were later published as Psychic Energy, Its Source, and Its Transformation. This work represented her most direct engagement with Jung's theoretical framework. She took up his concept of libido not in Freud's narrowly sexual sense, but in Jung's broader meaning of psychic energy itself, and explored how this energy manifested differently in men's and women's psychological development. Jung had described how libido moved through various channels, how it could be blocked and create neurosis, how it could be transformed through symbols into higher forms of consciousness. Harding agreed with all of this, but added that the channels themselves were gendered. She described how women's psychic energy was naturally more connected to cyclical processes, to the body's rhythms, to relational fields. When this energy was forced into linear, goal-oriented channels, the channels that masculine culture validated it, could create a specific kind of suffering that looked like neurosis, but was actually a form of spiritual exile from one's own nature. The transformation of psychic energy, Harding proposed, required different practices for women than for men. Where Jung emphasized active imagination as a technique for engaging the unconscious, sitting down, focusing consciousness, deliberately entering into dialogue with unconscious figures, Harding suggested that women often needed more receptive practices. She spoke of the importance of solitude, of time without agenda, of creating sacred space where the unconscious could emerge spontaneously rather than being sought deliberately. She was particularly interested in what she called devotional practices, practices like prayer, meditation, ritual, and contemplation that involved surrender rather than mastery. Jung had written about these practices too, especially in his later work on religion and alchemy, but he tended to intellectualize them, to see them as symbolic transformations that could be understood psychologically. Harding insisted on their lived reality, their necessity as actual practices rather than just as subjects of analysis. This emphasis on practice, on lived transformation rather than just understanding, became increasingly central to Harding's work. She had been trained as both physician and analyst, trained to observe, diagnose, and interpret, but her own psychological and spiritual development led her to value something beyond interpretation. She came to believe that healing occurred not primarily through understanding one's complexes and archetypes, but through a direct encounter with the numinous, with a sacred dimension of the psyche that could not be reduced to concepts. This put her in subtle tension with Jung's increasingly systematic approach. As Jung aged, as his collected works grew to many volumes, Analytical psychology took on the character of a comprehensive system, an elaborate map of the psyche's territories. Jung himself insisted that his was not a dogma, but a hypothesis, a set of provisional concepts always subject to revision based on clinical experience. Yet the very comprehensiveness of the system could become a problem, tempting practitioners to interpret experience through the lens of theory rather than remaining open to what wanted to emerge. Harding valued Jung's system and used its concepts in her own work. Yet she maintained a kind of epistemological humility, a recognition that the concepts were fingers pointing at Moon, not Moon itself. She insisted that psychological development required not just learning the map, but learning to navigate by the stars, by the intuitive sense of direction that came from one's own depths. This attitude was reflected in her clinical practice, where Jung conducted analyses that could stretch for years, with sessions devoted to careful exploration of dreams and active imagination. Harding's approach was often more direct. She trusted her intuition about what a patient needed. Sometimes this meant long analytical work, but sometimes it meant prescribing a practice, suggesting that a woman spend time alone, in nature, or create a small altar for meditation, or engage in some form of service that would take her out of self-preoccupation. She was less concerned with comprehensive understanding than with facilitating actual transformation. Her patients and students described her as having a kind of priestess quality. She carried the authority of her medical and analytical training, but she also carried something else, a connection to the mysteries she studied, a sense that she herself had undergone the descents and transformations she described in her books. When she spoke about the dark moon, about the goddess who descends to the underworld, she spoke not as a scholar, but as one who knew that territory from the inside. In the 1940s, Harding's work entered a new phase. She began to focus more explicitly on the spiritual dimensions of psychological development, on the ways that individuation in Jung's sense was inseparable from what religious traditions called spiritual awakening. Her book, The I and the Not I, published in 1944, explored the relationship between ego consciousness and what she called the transpersonal realm. The book's central argument was that psychological health required a proper relationship between the personal ego and mended, the transpersonal sources of meaning and energy. When ego claimed to be the center and source of consciousness, when it took credit for achievements and assumed it was in control, a kind of inflation occurred that inevitably led to suffering. True maturity came through recognizing what Harding called the not I, the autonomous forces within the psyche that acted independently of ego's will. This was recognizably Jungian territory. Jung had written extensively about the dangers of ego inflation and the necessity of recognizing the self as the true center of the psyche. But Harding brought her own emphasis to these themes. She described the not I in terms that drew on religious, mysticism, as well as psychology. She spoke of the necessity of a kind of ego death, a surrender of the illusion of personal control, as prerequisite for genuine spiritual development. This surrender was not pathological regression, but a conscious sacrifice, an offering of ego's limited perspective to something greater. For women, Harding suggested, this surrender often took a different form than for men. Men tended to have stronger ego boundaries, more identification with their conscious will and intentions. Their spiritual development often required a fairly dramatic deflation of ego, a humbling encounter with the unconscious that shattered their sense of mastery. Women, on the other hand, often struggled with the opposite problem, too little ego development, too much identification with the needs and feelings of others, insufficient sense of personal authority. The path for women, then, involved a paradox. First, they had to develop a stronger ego, had to claim their own authority, and learn to say "I" with conviction. Only then could they make a genuine sacrifice of this ego to the transpersonal. The surrender had to be a conscious choice, not a continuation of the unconscious self-negation that culture had trained into them. This was why Harding emphasized feminine authority and self-trust as necessary stages in development. Without them, women's spirituality could become another form of self-erasure rather than genuine transcendence. Jung found this argument compelling. In his correspondence with Harding during this period, he expressed appreciation for her insights into the specific challenges women faced in psychological development. He acknowledged that his own emphasis on ego relativization might need to be balanced in work with women by preliminary work on ego strengthening. Yet, even here, there was a subtle difference in emphasis. Jung tended to see this as a developmental sequence, first ego development, then ego relativization. That was the same for everyone. Even if women had more work to do in the first phase, Harding suggested something more complex, that for women, the process was less linear. Women did not simply build a strong ego and then surrender it. Instead, they moved in spirals, sometimes needing to claim authority, sometimes needing to surrender control. The rhythm determined not by a developmental stage, but by where they were in their natural cycles. The whole idea of a linear developmental path, Harding implied, might itself be a masculine bias that distorted understanding of women's psychology. This was a radical suggestion, though Harding made it quietly embedded in her clinical observations rather than stated as a theoretical challenge. She was proposing that not just the content, but the structure of psychological development might be gendered, that women's development followed different patterns than men's, patterns that were cyclical, recursive, spiral, rather than linear. If this was true, then applying Jung's individuation model directly to women might actually impede their development by measuring them against a masculine standard. Harding developed these ideas more fully in her later work, particularly in The Parental Image, Its Injury and Reconstruction, published in 1949. This book examined how early relationships with parents shaped the developing psyche and how damage to these foundational images had to be healed before further development could occur. The theme was classically psychoanalytic, but Harding's treatment was distinctly Jungian, emphasizing not just the personal parents, but the archetypal parental images that stood behind them. She described how girls needed, ideally, to experience their mothers as representatives of the positive feminine, nurturing but not engulfing, supportive but not possessive, a model of feminine authority and wisdom. When the personal mother failed to carry this positive image, either because of her own wounds or because she had internalized patriarchal devaluation of the feminine, the daughter was left without a foundation for her own feminine identity. She might then seek the positive mother in other women, in goddess figures, in her own capacity to mother herself. But this seeking was often complicated by grief and rage at the original absence. Similarly, girls needed fathers who could value them as daughters, who could reflect back their worth without sexualizing or controlling them, who could model masculine qualities while respecting feminine difference. When fathers were absent, dismissive, or invasive, daughters often internalized a negative masculine image that became the critical animus Harding had observed in her practice. Healing required not just understanding this dynamic, but finding positive masculine images, sometimes in relationships with trustworthy men, sometimes in supportive therapeutic relationships, sometimes in archetypal figures encountered in dreams and imagination. Throughout this book, Harding emphasized that healing of the parental images was not about excusing or forgetting actual harm. It was about separating the personal parents from the archetypal images they had failed to embody, so that one could have a relationship with the archetypes themselves. This allowed a kind of reparenting from within, a cultivation of internal good parents who could support further development. Jung's own theory of complexes had covered similar territory. He had shown how parental complexes shaped personality and how analysis required working through these complexes. But Harding brought to this work a particular sensitivity to the ways gender shaped the whole process. She understood how girls' development within patriarchy created specific injuries around feminine worth, how the cultural devaluation of mothers and the feminine principle compounded whatever personal failures the individual mother exhibited. She understood, too, how the idealization of fathers and masculinity made it difficult for women to see and heal from paternal wounds. A daughter might defend her father, insist he had done his best, even when objectively he had been neglectful or harmful, because to admit his failure was to acknowledge that the masculine itself, as she had experienced it, was unreliable. Better to blame herself, to assume she was unworthy of father's attention, than to face the terror of having no positive masculine foundation. Harding's work on these themes was deeply personal. She had had her own difficult relationship with her mother and her own journey of healing the maternal image within. She had experienced both the blessing and the complication of strong intellectual gifts in a culture that found intellectual women threatening. Her own analysis with Jung had involved working through these personal and archetypal parental issues, and her later work represented a distillation of that journey. By the 1950s, Harding was in her 60s and entering the phase of life she had written about as offering women particular opportunities for wisdom. She continued her analytic practice in New York, training new generations of Jungian analysts and treating patients who sought her particular expertise in women's psychology. She maintained her correspondence with Jung, though they saw each other infrequently. Jung himself was aging, increasingly frail, spending more time at his tower in Bollingen and less time seeing patients or students. Their relationship in these later years took on a quality of mutual appreciation across distance. Jung recognized Harding as one of his most important students, someone who had extended his work in vital directions. Harding honored Jung as the source of the psychological framework that had made her own explorations possible. Yet both also recognized the ways their perspectives had diverged, the questions Harding had raised about gender and embodiment that Jung's system could not fully accommodate. In 1953, Harding published Journey into Self, an exploration of what she called the spiritual path through the everyday. The book represented a synthesis of her life's work, bringing together her insights about feminine psychology, her understanding of archetypal patterns, and her conviction that psychological work was inseparable from spiritual practice. She described individuation not as a specialized process that occurred in analysis, but as a potential inherent in ordinary life, available to anyone willing to attend to the soul's movements. The book was structured around practical guidance for cultivating a relationship with the inner world. Harding described how to work with dreams, how to practice meditation and contemplation, how to create sacred time and space in the midst of busy modern life. She wrote about the importance of solitude, of regular periods of withdrawal from the world's demands to attend to inner needs. She described various forms of active imagination and creative expression as ways of giving form to unconscious contents. But perhaps most originally, she wrote about what she called the discipline of relationship. She suggested that intimate relationships, particularly between women, could serve as a kind of spiritual practice, a crucible for transformation as powerful as any meditative technique. When two people committed to honesty with each other and with themselves, when they agreed to see and be seen in their full complexity, the relationship became a mirror in which each could recognize aspects of self that remained invisible in solitude. This emphasis on relationship as spiritual practice reflected Harding's experience of the importance of women's friendships and her observation that women's development often occurred through and in relationship rather than in isolation. It was another quiet challenge to Jung's more introverted model, which tended to emphasize the individual's solitary encounter with the unconscious. Jung, reading Journey into Self, wrote to Harding praising its practical wisdom and accessibility. He appreciated her effort to bring analytical psychology out of the consulting room and into daily life. Yet, he also noted, in a letter to another colleague, that Harding sometimes seemed to undervalue the necessity of professional analysis, to suggest that people could do this work on their own or with friends. Jung felt that the unconscious contained forces too powerful and potentially destructive to be engaged without the container of the analytic relationship and the guidance of someone trained to recognize the dangers. This disagreement pointed to another subtle divergence between them. Jung had experienced, in his own confrontation with the unconscious, how terrifying and disorienting that encounter could be. He had barely maintained his functioning during those years after the break with Freud, when archetypal figures and visions threatened to overwhelm him. His insistence on the necessity of professional analysis partly reflected this knowledge of how dangerous the depths could be. Harding's experience had been different. Her descent into the unconscious had been held within her analysis with Jung, and had perhaps been gentler, more gradual. Moreover, she worked primarily with women, and she observed that women's relationship to the unconscious often lacked the same quality of alien otherness that men experienced. Women seemed to have, on average, more permeable boundaries between conscious and unconscious, more natural access to dreams and intuitions. They were more at risk of being overwhelmed by unconscious contents, certainly, but they were also more at home in that realm. Thus, where Jung emphasized the necessity of a strong therapeutic container, Harding emphasized the necessity of trust. Trust in one's own capacity to navigate the inner world, trust in the self's guidance, trust that the psyche naturally moved toward wholeness if one could create the conditions for its unfolding. Both emphases were needed, but they reflected different experiences of the psyche's depths. In 1957, Jung's wife Emma died, and Carl entered a period of grief and decline. He would live for another 4 years, but his active work was largely finished. He continued to receive visitors at Bollingen and to work on his late writings about alchemy and synchronicity, but the great creative period of his life had passed. Harding, saddened by Emma's death, Emma Jung had been a significant figure in analytical psychology in her own right, and Harding had known and admired her, sent her condolences and reflections on the mystery of endings and continuations. When Jung himself died in June 1961, Harding was 74 years old. She mourned him as one mourns a teacher who has shaped one's whole life, who has given one the tools and the permission to become oneself. Yet her mourning was also that of a colleague who had walked beside Jung for nearly 4 decades, who had taken what he offered and created something new with it, who had honored him precisely by not merely repeating him, but by extending and questioning and refining his insights. After Jung's death, Harding continued her work for another 10 years. She published The Value and Meaning of Depression in 1962, exploring how periods of darkness and withdrawal often signal the psyche's need for transformation, how what looked like pathological depression might sometimes be a necessary descent that, if engaged consciously, could lead to renewal. She continued to see patients, continued to lecture and teach, continued to refine her understanding of feminine psychology and spiritual development. In these final years, she focused increasingly on what she called the wisdom of age. She wrote about how the post-menopausal years offered women liberation from the biological imperatives and social expectations that had constrained their earlier life, free from the possibility of pregnancy, free often from caretaking responsibilities. Older women could focus on their own development in new ways. The culture tended to see older women as irrelevant, finished, but Harding saw them as having access to a kind of authority and wisdom that was impossible earlier in life. This wisdom came not from accumulated knowledge, but from integration, from the long work of bringing together the disparate aspects of one's life into some coherent whole. It came from having survived losses and disappointments, from having learned that what one assumed to be true was often not, from having discovered resources within that one had not known were there. It came from the gradual transformation of ego's perspective, from identification with the small personal self to a sense of participation in something larger. Harding herself embodied this wisdom. Those who knew her in her final years described her as having a quality of presence that was both grounded and luminous. She carried her learning lightly, was more interested in listening than in displaying what she knew. She had a way of seeing directly into the heart of a matter, of offering a single sentence or image that could shift someone's entire perspective. She had become, in the language of her own work, a wise old woman, a living example of the archetype she had studied. Esther Harding died on August 7th, 1971, at the age of 84. She left behind a body of written work that continues to influence Jungian psychology and a legacy of students and patients whose lives were transformed by their work with her. More than any formal legacy, she left a demonstration that Jung's psychology could be taken up by women and transformed from within, that the framework he provided was spacious enough to accommodate insights and emphases he himself had not fully articulated. We must return now to the question that has guided this exploration from the beginning. What is the nature of the relationship between Jung and Harding? Not the biographical facts, which we have traced, but the deeper pattern, the archetypal relationship they enacted. They were teacher and student, certainly, but also fellow explorers. He was the cartographer who provided the map. She was the traveler who discovered what lay off the map's edges. He described the territory from a masculine vantage point. She brought the feminine gaze that revealed features he could not see. Jung's psychology rested on his understanding of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche containing universal patterns, archetypes that shaped human experience across cultures and eras. These archetypes appeared in myths and dreams, in religious symbolism and fairy tales. They were autonomous, meaning they acted independently of conscious will, appearing in dreams and visions as distinct. Personalities, the shadow, the anima or animus, the wise old man or woman, the divine child, the self. For Jung, analytical psychology was fundamentally about coming into right relationship with these archetypal forces, Neurosis occurred when one identified too closely with an archetype or denied its claims entirely. Health involved recognizing the archetypes, understanding their demands, and finding ways to honor them without being possessed by them. And individuation, the goal of analysis, involved a progressive differentiation and integration of these archetypal aspects until one could relate to the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcended all the others. This was the framework, elegant and comprehensive, that Jung bequeathed to his students, and Harding affirmed its essential truth. She too saw the archetypes at work in her patients' dreams. She too understood neurosis as a disturbance in the relationship between ego and archetypal realm. She too saw individuation as the goal toward which the psyche naturally moved if the obstacles could be cleared. But she brought a different set of questions to this framework. She asked, if the archetypes are universal, why do they appear so differently to men and women? Is the difference merely cultural, or does embodiment itself shape the archetypal realm? Is there such a thing as a feminine archetype, a pattern that organizes women's experience as women rather than as humans? And if so, how does this feminine archetype relate to Jung's anima, which is specifically a man's image of the feminine? These questions led Harding to propose a subtle but significant modification of Jung's theory. She suggested that the anima and animus were not the only or even the primary archetypal structures related to gender. Beneath or beyond these contrasexual images lay what she called the archetypal feminine and masculine essential patterns of being that were not simply opposites of each other, but complete principles in themselves. The archetypal feminine, in Harding's understanding, was associated with certain qualities and modes of consciousness. It was receptive rather than active, cyclical rather than linear, relational rather than autonomous, embodied rather than abstract. It knew through participation, through immersion in experience, rather than through distanced observation. It valued being as much as doing, process as much as product. It honored the dark and hidden as much as the light and visible. These qualities were not merely stereotypes of femininity imposed by culture, though culture certainly shaped how they were understood and valued. They were, Harding proposed, rooted in bodily experience in the female body's capacity to receive, to gestate, to bring forth new life. Even women who never bore children carried this potential in their bodies, and it shaped their psychological structure. The womb was not just a physical organ, but a psychic symbol, an image of the space where transformation occurred, where something other could grow and eventually be born. Similarly, the archetypal masculine was associated with focus, linearity, separation, transcendence. It knew through analysis, through taking things apart and understanding their components. It valued goal achievement, mastery, clarity of definition. It sought the light, the visible, the explicit, and it was connected, psychologically, to the male body's experience, to the phallus as penetrating rather than receiving, to semen as projected outward rather than contained within. These archetypal patterns manifested in all psyches. Harding agreed with Jung on that. Men had some access to feminine qualities and needed to develop them. Women had access to masculine qualities and needed to develop them too. This was the anima-animus development Jung had described. But for a woman, Harding insisted, the primary task was not integrating the masculine animus, but understanding and embodying the archetypal, feminine in its fullness, including aspects that culture had devalued or forbidden. This meant learning to trust receptivity, to value the dark and hidden phases of experience, to honor cycles and rhythms rather than trying to maintain constant productivity. It meant discovering what Harding called virgin consciousness, not virginity in the sexual sense, but a quality of being unto oneself, complete and sufficient, not dependent on relationship with masculine to feel whole. This virgin consciousness was crucial, Harding argued, because without it, women's receptivity could become passive victimization. If a woman was only receptive, only relational, only oriented toward others, she lost herself. She became a doormat, a martyr, absorbed into others' needs and desires. The receptivity had to be rooted in a core of self-possession, a capacity to receive consciously and to refuse reception when that was appropriate. This was the psychological meaning of the virgin goddess Artemis, or Diana, who belonged to no man but herself, who was complete in her feminine nature without needing masculine complement. Jung had touched on these ideas in his later work, particularly in his writings on alchemy, where he explored the sacred marriage of masculine and feminine. But he tended to see the masculine and feminine as requiring each other for completion, as two halves that joined to form a whole. Harding was proposing something more complex, that each principle was complete in itself, that wholeness did not always mean union of opposites, but could mean full embodiment of one's own principle. This was perhaps her most radical departure from Jung's framework, though she stated it so quietly that its implications were easy to miss. She was suggesting that individuation for women did not necessarily require the integration of masculine animus in the way Jung described. It required, instead, the full realization of the feminine principle, which included within itself both light and dark, both creating and destroying, both nurturing and autonomous capacities. The animus, in this revised understanding, was not woman's path to wholeness, but rather could be an obstacle if it intruded too early or too forcefully. The negative animus that criticized and undermined needed to be confronted and disempowered. The positive animus that could think clearly and act decisively was valuable, but it was a tool in service of the feminine self, not the feminine self's opposite or completion. Let us consider what this meant in practice, in the actual work of analysis. When a woman came to Jung with psychological suffering, he would listen to her dreams and identify the archetypal patterns at play. If she dreamed of being chased, he might interpret the pursuer as shadow, aspects of herself she had repressed. If she dreamed of a commanding male figure, he might identify this as animus, her inner masculine, that needed to be integrated. If she described conflicts in her relationships or work, he would often frame these as manifestations of the individuation process, the psyche's attempt to push her toward greater wholeness through conflict and tension. This approach was often helpful. Many women found that Jung's interpretations gave them a framework for understanding experiences that had seemed merely painful or confusing. They recognized themselves in the archetypal patterns he described. They felt less alone, knowing their struggles were not merely personal but connected to universal human patterns. Yet sometimes, Harding observed, Jung's interpretations missed something crucial. A woman would describe feeling exhausted, depleted, unable to access her own desires or needs. Jung might interpret this as excessive identification with the anima, with being too feminine, too absorbed in relationship and feeling. He might suggest that she needed to develop her animus, to become more focused and goal-oriented, to establish clearer boundaries, But Harding, listening to the same woman, might hear something different. The exhaustion was not from being too feminine, but from trying to be feminine in the way culture demanded, self-sacrificing, always available, never asserting her own needs. The problem was not too much anima identification, but too little connection to the deep feminine, to the fierce and autonomous goddess who could say no, who could withdraw and restore herself, who could honor her own cycles rather than forcing herself to be constantly productive. The treatment, in Harding's hands, would focus not on developing masculine qualities, but on reconnecting the woman to her own depths. She might suggest that the woman spend time alone in nature, that she observe the moon's phases and notice how her energy and needs shifted cyclically, that she creates small rituals to mark transitions and honor feelings. She might encourage the woman to explore goddess mythology, to find images of fierce, autonomous femininity that could counteract the culture's narrow definition of acceptable womanhood. And crucially, Harding would help the woman identify and challenge the negative animus, that internalized critical voice that told her she was never good enough, that interpreted her natural rhythms as laziness or self-indulgence, that demanded she ignore her body's and psyche's needs to conform to external expectations. This negative animus had to be recognized not as truth, but as psychological pollution, absorbed from a culture that devalued the feminine. This difference in approach, Jung's emphasis on animus development, Harding's emphasis on deep feminine connection, reflected their different positions. Jung, as a man, had had to develop relationship with his anima, his inner feminine, and this development had been central to his individuation. He generalized from his experience, assuming that the parallel process for women was animus development. But Harding knew from the inside that women's primary task was different. A woman did not need to discover the feminine as man did. She lived in a female body, had been raised as a girl, was constantly confronted with cultural messages about femininity. Her task was not to discover the feminine, but to separate true femininity from cultural distortion, to find the archetypal depths beneath the conventional surface. Only after this reconnection with her own feminine ground could she beneficially integrate masculine capacities without those capacities becoming another form of self-alienation. Let us explore this through a specific example drawn from Harding's clinical writings. She described working with a woman who dreamed repeatedly of descending into a cave where a terrible goddess dwelt, a figure both terrifying and magnetic. The woman would wake from these dreams in dread, feeling that something awful was pursuing her. Jung, analyzing such a dream, might have focused on the cave as a symbol of the unconscious and the terrible. Goddess as a manifestation of the devouring mother archetype, the negative feminine that threatens to engulf ego consciousness. He might have encouraged the woman to strengthen her ego boundaries, to develop her animus capacity for discrimination and separation, so she could resist being drawn into the unconscious. Harding, in contrast, helped the woman understand the terrible goddess as a representation of aspects of the feminine that the woman had rejected in herself, her anger, her autonomy, her capacity to destroy as well as create. The dreams were not warnings against the unconscious, but invitations to descend, to face and integrate what had been rejected. The terror was the terror of encountering one's own power, one's wholeness that included destructive as well as nurturing capacities. Through a process of active imagination and exploration of goddess myths, particularly the story of Inanna's descent to meet her dark sister Ereshkigal in the underworld, Harding helped the woman see the dreams as depicting a necessary initiation. The woman needed to descend to meet the terrible goddess, to symbolically die to her conventional femininity so she could be reborn into a more complete relationship with her own feminine nature. This descent did not mean rejecting ego consciousness or becoming overwhelmed by affect. It meant a conscious engagement with depths that had previously been feared and avoided. Over time, as the woman worked with these dreams and engaged in practices that honored the dark feminine solitude, honest expression of anger, refusal to be constantly available and pleasing, the terrible goddess in her dreams transformed. She became less overtly threatening, more complex, still powerful but also wise, a source of deep knowing rather than merely a devouring force. This transformation reflected, Harding would say, the integration not of animus, but of the complete feminine archetype, light and dark together. The woman had not become more masculine. She had become more wholly feminine, which included capacities for fierce autonomy and creative destruction alongside her nurturing and relational gifts. This emphasis on descent, on going down into depths rather than ascending to heights, pervaded Harding's work and represented another significant difference from Jung's framework. Jung, while he honored the unconscious and recognized the necessity of engaging it, tended to frame individuation as an upward movement, a development toward greater consciousness, complexity, and integration. The goal was the self, often symbolized by images of light, mandalas, and transcendent unity. Harding did not reject this upward movement, but suggested that it needed to be balanced by descent, particularly for women. The feminine principle was associated with depth, with earth and water, rather than air and fire, with darkness that gestated new life. Psychological development required learning to value the dark as much as the light, to trust the fallow periods and the times of not knowing, to honor the destructive phases that cleared away what no longer served. She wrote extensively about moon symbolism as central to understanding this different orientation. The moon, unlike the sun, was constantly changing, moving through phases of fullness and emptiness. At the dark moon, it disappeared entirely. Yet, this disappearance was not death, but preparation for renewal. Women, Harding observed, needed to learn to honor their own dark moon times, periods of withdrawal, depression, emptiness, as necessary phases in a cycle, rather than as problems to be fixed. Contemporary culture, being solar and masculine in its orientation, valued constant visibility, constant productivity, unchanging presence. This created particular suffering for women, whose bodily and psychological rhythms were more lunar. They were asked to maintain the same energy and output at all points in their cycle, to be equally social and productive, whether they were at the peak of their energy or at the low ebb. This constant demand for solar consciousness, Harding argued, exhausted women and cut them off from their own nature. Jung had written about the importance of enantiodromia, the principle that psychological contents tend toward their opposites. Too much consciousness calls forth the unconscious. Too much order invites chaos. But Jung tended to see these swings as problems to be balanced through individuation. Harding suggested that for women, the swing itself was natural and healthy, that the goal was not to transcend the cycle, but to become conscious within it, to move with it rather than against it. This acceptance of cyclical rhythm extended to Harding's understanding of the life cycle. Where Jung described individuation as a relatively linear process with distinct phases, the first half of life devoted to ego development and adaptation to the world, the second half to turning inward and relativizing ego in favor of self, Harding saw women's development as more recursive. Women might turn inward during menstruation each month, a miniature second half of life. They might experience death and rebirth with each pregnancy and birth. Their development spiraled through these cycles rather than progressing linearly. This had implications for how one worked analytically with women at different life stages. Jung tended to see the midlife transition as the crucial turning point, the time when the orientation shifted from outer to inner. Harding agreed that midlife was significant, but she emphasized that many women experienced major psychological transitions at other points, at menarche, at first sexual experience, at pregnancy and birth, at menopause. Each of these could be an initiation, a death of an old identity and birth of a new one, requiring psychological work and conscious integration. She was particularly interested in menopause, which she saw as potentially the most profound initiation of all. At menopause, a woman's identity, as defined by reproductive capacity, ended. This was culturally experienced as a loss, a becoming invisible and irrelevant. But psychologically, Harding suggested, it was a liberation. Freed from the biological imperatives that had shaped the first half of life, a woman could discover who she was beyond her role as potential mother, beyond her attractiveness to men, beyond all the definitions imposed by a reproductive capacity she no longer carried. This postmenopausal phase was when women could fully claim the archetype of the wise old woman, the crone who had lived long enough to see through illusions, who had survived losses and learned from them, who could speak truth because she no longer needed approval or validation. This was not a diminishment, but an arrival, the culmination of all the earlier phases and initiations. Jung had written about the wise old man as an archetype, a figure who appeared in men's dreams and fantasies as guide and teacher. The wise old woman appeared in mythology too as witch, crone, fairy godmother, but Jung had given her less attention. Harding brought this figure forward, describing her not just as an archetype that appeared in dreams, but as a potential that women could embody in their own lives. She described the qualities of the wise old woman, a deep acceptance of what is, combined with fierce clarity about what should be, a capacity to see through pretense and illusion, a groundedness in bodily reality combined with spiritual insight, a sense of humor about the human condition, a certain detachment from personal concerns that allowed concern for larger questions. Most crucially, the wise old woman trusted her own knowing, valued her own experience as the final authority. This inner authority was perhaps the quality Harding emphasized most consistently throughout her work. She returned to it again and again, in different contexts and at different levels. For women, she insisted, the central psychological task was developing trust in one's own perceptions, feelings, intuitions, and judgments. Trust that did not require validation from external sources, particularly from men or masculine institutions. This inner authority was not the same as ego, inflation, or arrogance. It was not a claim to be always right or to have special knowledge. It was something more fundamental, a willingness to trust that one's own experience was real and valid, that one's own feelings and perceptions meant something, that one did not need an external expert to tell one what one was experiencing or what one needed. For women living in a patriarchal culture, developing this inner authority was profoundly difficult. From earliest childhood, Girls were taught to defer to others' judgments, particularly males. A girl's experience of herself was constantly mediated through others' perceptions. Was she pretty? Was she pleasing? Was she good? Her own sense of reality was routinely denied. She was told she was too sensitive, too emotional, didn't understand, was overreacting. She learned to distrust her own perceptions and defer to authorities, usually male, who presumably knew better. This training in self-distrust was what Harding identified as the negative animus in its cultural manifestation. It was not just an intrapsychic structure, but an internalization of patriarchal power. The work of analysis, then, was not politically neutral, but necessarily involved helping women recognize and resist this internalized oppression. Here, Harding was ahead of her time, anticipating what would later be called feminist psychology. She did not use explicitly political language that was not the discourse of her era, but her emphasis on women's self-trust and inner authority had political implications. If women learned to trust their own experience and knowing, they would necessarily begin to question the cultural arrangements that required their subordination and self-silencing. Jung was less comfortable with this political dimension. He tended to see psychological work as separate from social criticism. The goal was individuation, becoming whole, and while this might lead an individual to resist collective norms, Jung did not see depth psychology as inherently a force for social change. In fact, he sometimes worried that political activism could become a way of avoiding inner work, projecting one's own shadow onto social institutions rather than confronting it in oneself. Harding understood this concern and shared it to some extent. She agreed that political activity could be a distraction from necessary psychological work, but she also saw that for women, claiming inner authority inevitably brought them into conflict with social arrangements. A woman who learned to trust her own knowing would necessarily resist expectations that she defer, please, and self-sacrifice. Her individuation could not be separated from challenging the cultural structures that impeded it. This tension between the individual and the collective, between inner work and social change, remained largely implicit in Harding's writings. She focused on the individual woman's psychological development rather than on social reform, yet her work empowered women in ways that had social consequences. Women who went through analysis with Harding often found themselves making significant changes in their outer lives, leaving unfulfilling marriages, pursuing deferred ambitions, claiming authority in professional settings, refusing to accept treatment that diminished them. These were not the primary goals of the work. The goal was always psychological wholeness, but they were natural consequences of it. A woman who had claimed her inner feminine authority, who had developed trust in her own knowing, who had integrated the fierce autonomous goddess alongside the nurturing mother, simply could not remain in situations that required her to be less than she was. Let us turn now to Harding's understanding of relationship, for this was another area where her insights extended and complicated Jung's framework. Jung had emphasized the importance of relationship for individuation, relationship with the analyst, with intimate partners, with friends. These relationships served as mirrors, revealing aspects of self that remained invisible in isolation. They also provided the friction necessary for growth, the conflicts and misunderstandings that forced one to see beyond one's projections and recognize the other as genuinely other. But Jung's focus was ultimately on the individual's development. Relationships were important because they facilitated individuation, but individuation itself was an individual process. The goal was to become whole in oneself, and while this wholeness included the capacity for genuine relationship, relationship was not itself the goal. Harding's emphasis was subtly different. She suggested that for women, relationship was not just a means to individuation, but was itself a form of psychological experience, a way of being that had its own validity. Women's sense of self was fundamentally relational. She argued not in the sense that women lacked individual identity, but in the sense that their identity included connection as a core element rather than as something added to an already complete self. This was another way of describing the feminine principle as inherently relational, as experiencing reality through connection and participation rather than through separation and objectivity. Men, in Jung's psychology, had to develop relationship as integration of anima, as learning to connect with what was other to their basic masculine orientation. Women lived relationship from the beginning. Their task was not to learn connection, but to maintain connection with self while also connecting with others. This distinction had significant implications. It meant that women's psychological development could not be understood adequately through a model based on masculine experience. The masculine model assumed a fundamental separateness that then learned to relate. The feminine experience was of fundamental connection that then learned to differentiate, to maintain boundaries without losing the connection. Harding explored this, particularly in relation to mother-daughter relationships. Jung had written about the mother complex, the constellation of feelings, memories, and archetypal images that clustered around a person's experience of mother. But he wrote primarily from a masculine perspective the son's relationship with mother, the way she represented for him the first other, the first experience of love and nurturance from outside himself. The daughter's relationship with mother was different, Harding showed. Mother was not other but the same, the original mirror, the person who showed daughter what it meant to be female. The separation necessary for development was thus more fraught, involving not just leaving a loved person, but differentiating from someone who represented one's own identity. If daughter could not differentiate from mother, she remained unconsciously identified, unable to develop her own way of being feminine. But if she rejected mother entirely, she lost connection to the feminine principle itself, becoming alienated from her own nature. The path required maintaining connection while also differentiating being like mother in the shared femininity while being different in the particular way that femininity manifested. This was a more complex negotiation than the son's simpler task of separation. It required what Harding called subtle discrimination, the ability to see both sameness and difference simultaneously. Moreover, the daughter's relationship with mother was profoundly affected by culture's devaluation of the feminine. If mother had internalized this devaluation, if she herself did not embody positive feminine authority, then daughter had no good model. She might identify with a wounded mother out of loyalty and compassion, taking on the same self-negation. Or she might reject mother contemptuously, and in rejecting her, reject her own femininity, identifying instead with masculine values in an attempt to escape the devaluation attached to being female. Either path led to splitting between good masculine and bad feminine, between acceptable public self and rejected private depths, between who one seemed to be and who one actually was. Healing required, Harding suggested, a complex process of recognizing mother's wounds without being defined by them, of finding the positive feminine in archetype when it could not be found in the personal mother, of forgiving mother for her limitations, while also acknowledging the harm those limitations caused. This emphasis on the necessity of forgiving while also acknowledging harm was characteristic of Harding's approach. She did not believe in forced forgiveness or in spiritual bypassing, using spirituality to avoid painful feelings. The hurt had to be felt, the anger honored. Only then could forgiveness emerge naturally, not as obligation but as release, as recognition that everyone, including Mother, was struggling with their own wounds and limitations. Jung would have agreed with this, certainly. His own psychology honored the necessity of confronting painful emotions rather than repressing them. But Harding brought a particular sensitivity to how gender shaped these dynamics. She understood how daughters were pressured to be loyal to mothers, to deny or minimize maternal failures in ways that sons were not. The cultural expectation that women be nurturing and self-sacrificing made it difficult for daughters to acknowledge when mothers had failed at this expectation, because the acknowledgement seemed to play into devaluation of women. The answer was not to deny the failure, but to separate the personal mother's limitations from the archetypal feminine's capacity. Mother had done her best within her limitations, but her best was insufficient, and daughter had been harmed. This truth had to be acknowledged. Then daughter could seek the good mother elsewhere in other women, in her own capacity to mother herself, in the archetypal images that appeared in dreams and imagination. This remothering process was central to much of Harding's clinical work. She helped women develop an inner good mother who could offer the unconditional acceptance, nurturance, and validation they had not received from their personal mothers. This inner figure was not merely a compensation for what was lacking, but a direct relationship with the archetypal mother, the great mother who existed in the collective unconscious as a potential for all humans. Jung had written extensively about the great mother archetype, drawing on mythology from around the world to show how this figure appeared universally as Demeter and Gaia, as Isis and Kali, as countless goddesses of fertility, nourishment, and protection. The Great Mother was dual, both nurturing and devouring, both giving life and taking it away. She represented nature itself, the source from which life emerged and to which it returned. Harding agreed with Jung's analysis, but added that women's relationship with the Great Mother was more direct and embodied than men's. Men encountered the Great Mother as other, as the feminine power that gave them life and could take it away. Women participated in the Great Mother, carried her potential in their own bodies, could actually give birth and nourish new life. This participation was both privilege and burden. Privilege because it connected women directly to the creative power of nature. Burden because it could overwhelm individual identity, dissolving woman into mere biological function. The psychological task for women, then, was to consciously relate to the Great Mother rather than being unconsciously identified with her. This meant honoring one's capacity for nurturance and creation while also maintaining boundaries, recognizing when enough had been given, when nurturance became enabling or self-depletion, when the life-giving aspect needed to balance with the capacity to destroy what no longer served. This balance between creation and destruction was another theme Harding returned to repeatedly. The feminine principle, she insisted, was not only nurturing but also fierce and destructive. The goddess who gave life also took it away. Demeter, who blessed the harvest, could also blight the fields. Kali, who danced creation into being, also danced it into dissolution. This destructive aspect was not evil but necessary, the clearing away that made space for new growth, the ending that allowed beginning. Yet culture taught women to repress their destructive capacities, to identify only with nurturance and care. Anger was unfeminine. Aggression was unacceptable. The capacity to end relationships or withdraw support was selfish. Women who expressed these energies were labeled as witches, bitches, cold, castrating. The cultural message was clear. Acceptable femininity was only life-giving, only nurturing, only supportive. This split between acceptable and unacceptable femininity created profound psychological conflict. The rejected energies did not disappear, but went into shadow, appearing as depression, passive aggression, psychosomatic symptoms, or explosive rage that seemed to come from nowhere. Healing required integrating the destructive feminine, learning to express anger directly, to say no without guilt, to end what needed ending, to honor the necessity of death as part of the life cycle. Harding explored this theme through her studies of goddess mythology, particularly the dark goddesses Hecate, the witch, Lilith, the demon, the Sumerian goddess Ereshkigal who ruled underworld. These figures had been demonized by patriarchal religion, transformed from complex deities into symbols of evil. But Harding saw them as representations of necessary aspects of the feminine principle, the wildness that refused domestication, the sexual autonomy that threatened male control, the deadly power that balanced birth-giving. Reclaiming these dark goddesses was a way of reclaiming the rejected aspects of femininity. A woman who could honor Lilith within herself could claim her sexual desire as her own rather than as response to male need. A woman who could honor Hecate could trust her intuition, her knowledge of hidden things, her capacity for transformation and magic. A woman who could honor Ereshkigal could accept the necessity of descent, of times of darkness and dissolution. This reclamation was not about literal goddess worship, though some of Harding's patients and students did develop personal spiritual practices involving goddess images. It was about restoring balance to the psyche, bringing back what had been rejected, allowing the full range of human capacity rather than only the narrow range culture deemed acceptable for women. Jung would have supported this project in principle. His psychology was fundamentally about integration of the rejected and despised, about making conscious what had been unconscious. He had emphasized the necessity of shadow work, of confronting the aspects of self-deemed unacceptable. Yet, in practice, his understanding of woman's shadow was often shaped by his masculine perspective and his cultural assumptions. When Jung described women's shadow, he often focused on qualities like calculation, coldness, opacity, the negative animus that appeared when anima in men turned negative. But Harding observed that women's shadow often contained different contents: natural aggression, healthy autonomy, sexual desire, ambition, the capacity to prioritize self over others' needs. These were not negative qualities that needed to be transformed, but healthy capacities that had been driven into shadow by cultural shaming. The work was thus not integration of actual shadow, but recognition that what had been labeled as shadow was often simply the full range of human capacity, aspects that were shadowed only because culture deemed them inappropriate for women. Bringing these aspects into consciousness did not make women more masculine or more complete. It made them more fully and consciously feminine, embodying the complete archetype rather than only its culturally acceptable manifestations. This distinction between cultural shadow and psychological shadow was crucial for Harding's feminist sensibility. Not everything that appeared as shadow in women's psyches was truly shadow in the Jungian sense of rejected aspects of self. Some of it was natural capacity that had been pathologized by patriarchal culture. The task was to discriminate between what genuinely needed integration because it was one-sided or destructive, and what needed reclamation because it had been wrongly rejected. Let us explore now Harding's understanding of sexuality, for this was another area where her work extended and complicated Jung's framework. Jung had written about sexuality primarily in terms of projection and relationship dynamics. Sexual attraction, in his view, often involved projection of anima or animus onto a partner, seeing them not as they truly were, but as carriers of one's own inner opposite. The initial attraction could be intense precisely because it was numinous, carrying archetypal energy. But as projection withdrew, as one began to see the actual person rather than the projected image, disillusionment often followed. The psychological task, Jung suggested, was to withdraw projections, to recognize anima or animus within oneself, rather than seeking them in partners. This did not mean sexuality lost its power, but its power shifted from unconscious projection to conscious relationship between two individuals who recognized each other's reality. Mature sexuality, in Jung's view, involved less projection and more genuine encounter. Harding agreed with this analysis as far as it went. She, too, saw how projection complicated relationship, how people often fell in love with their own anima or animus images, rather than with the actual person before them. She, too, believed that maturity involved withdrawing projections and relating more directly. But she added that for women, sexuality involved layers of complexity that Jung's framework did not fully address. First, women's sexuality had been so overlaid with cultural shame, prohibition, and objectification that many women had no clear sense of their own sexual desire, separate from what they had been taught they should want or how they should respond. They had been taught that their value lay in their attractiveness to men, that their sexuality existed to respond to male desire, that their own desire was either non-existent or dangerous. The psychological task, then, was not primarily about withdrawing projections, but about discovering one's own sexual nature beneath the layers of cultural conditioning. What did a woman actually desire? What gave her pleasure? What were her own rhythms and cycles of arousal and satisfaction? These questions could not be answered through analysis of projection, but required a kind of embodied exploration, a willingness to experience sexuality directly rather than only conceptually. Second, Harding observed that women's sexuality was more complex and varied than the phallic model assumed. Where male sexuality was often fairly direct arousal, erection, penetration, climax, women's sexuality was more diffuse, more cyclical, more connected to emotional and relational context. A woman might experience arousal in her whole body rather than concentrated in genital sensation. Her capacity for pleasure might vary significantly with where she was in her cycle. She might need extended time and particular emotional connection to fully open sexually. This difference was not pathology or immaturity, but a different organization of sexual experience. The problem was that cultural understanding of sexuality was based on the masculine model, treating female sexuality as if it should conform to male patterns. When it did not, when women needed more time, more emotional connection, more varied stimulation, this was seen as women's dysfunction rather than as evidence that the model itself was inadequate. Harding suggested that women's sexuality was more similar to the moon's phases than to the sun's steady shining. There were times of fullness when sexual desire was strong and satisfaction easily reached. There were times of waning when sexuality withdrew, when a woman needed solitude and inwardness rather than connection. Trying to maintain constant availability and responsiveness went against this natural rhythm and created suffering. Moreover, women's sexuality was profoundly connected to the mystery of their creative capacity. The same organs and energies that opened in sexual pleasure were those that could conceive, gestate, and birth new life. Sex was thus never only personal pleasure, but always even unconsciously, connected to this procreative potential. This created a different psychological weight to sexuality for women than for men, for whom sex and procreation were more separable. This did not mean women's sexuality was always about procreation. Harding was clear that women could and did engage in sexuality purely for pleasure. But she suggested that women's relationship to their sexuality was more complex because of this inherent connection to life-creating power. This was another aspect of the Great Mother archetype, the connection between sexuality, fertility, and the life force itself. Harding explored these themes, particularly in relation to what she called ritual prostitution. In ancient goddess religions, she drew on anthropological studies of temple priestesses in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, who engaged in sexual activity as part of religious practice. These women were not prostitutes in the modern sense. They were not selling sex for money or being exploited. Rather, they were understood as embodying the goddess, and sexual union with them was a form of sacred participation in divine creative power. What interested Harding was not the literal practice, which belonged to a different cultural context, but what it revealed about the psychology of feminine sexuality. It showed that sexuality could be experienced as sacred rather than profane, as a gift offered rather than a commodity sold or a duty owed. It showed women as active agents of sexuality rather than passive recipients of male desire, and it showed sexuality as potentially a spiritual practice, a way of connecting with divine creative power. Modern women, Harding suggested, had lost this sense of sexuality as sacred. They had been taught either that sex was shameful, something to be hidden and repressed, or that it was casual, something to be consumed without meaning. Neither approach honored sexuality as a profound capacity, a form of creative power that deserved reverence and consciousness. Reclaiming the sacredness of sexuality meant, for Harding, several things. It meant recognizing one's own sexual desire as valid and important, not secondary to a partner's needs. It meant claiming agency in sexual encounters, being active rather than only receptive, offering oneself consciously rather than waiting to be taken. It meant creating conditions that honored the encounter-appropriate time, setting, emotional connection, rather than treating sexuality as something that could happen casually anytime, anywhere. And it meant understanding sexuality as a form of energy that could be cultivated and transformed. This was where Harding's understanding of sexuality connected to her broader interest in spiritual practice. She drew on traditions of Kundalini Yoga and Tantric Buddhism to explore how sexual energy, when consciously engaged, could become a path to psychological and spiritual transformation. This emphasis on sexuality as spiritual practice was controversial in Jungian circles. Jung himself had been somewhat ambivalent about the body and sexuality. He recognized their importance and wrote about sexual symbolism in dreams and myths, but his focus was always on the psychological meaning rather than the physical experience. He tended to see bodily experiences as valuable, primarily for what they symbolized or revealed about psyche. Harding, with her medical training and her attention to women's embodied experience, insisted on the body's reality and significance. Sexuality was not just a symbol, it was a lived experience that shaped consciousness. The body was not just a container for psyche, but was itself psychic, a form of knowing and experiencing that could not be reduced to mind. This insistence on embodiment pervaded all of Harding's work. Where Jung tended toward abstraction, toward theorizing about archetypal patterns, Harding remained grounded in the concrete, in the actual experiences of women's bodies. in the specific practices that facilitated transformation, in the lived reality of suffering and healing. She used Jung's concepts, but always brought them back to earth, asking not just what they meant, but how they were experienced, what practical difference they made in people's lives. This difference in approach reflected, once again, their different positions. Jung was a theoretician, a systematizer, someone who sought to create a comprehensive map of the psyche. His genius lay in recognizing patterns, in synthesizing insights from mythology, religion, anthropology, and clinical work into a coherent framework. This required a certain distance, a view from above that could see the whole terrain. Harding was more of a practitioner, a guide, someone who walked with individuals through their particular journeys. Her genius lay in attention to the specific, to the unique way archetypal patterns manifested in each person's life, to the practical question of what helped and what did not. This required being in the trenches, immersed in the mess and complexity of actual therapeutic work. Both approaches were necessary. Jung's systematic theorizing provided the framework that made sense of individual experiences. Harding's attention to particularity kept the theory connected to reality, prevented it from becoming an abstract system disconnected from lived experience. Together, they represented complementary modes, the masculine capacity for systematizing and the feminine capacity for remaining in relationship with the particular. This complementarity extended to their different ways of writing. Jung's prose was dense, complex, layered with references to mythology, philosophy, and religion. Reading Jung required concentration, a willingness to follow intricate arguments and hold multiple concepts in mind simultaneously. His writing was brilliant but not always accessible, certainly not to casual readers. Harding wrote more simply and directly. She used Jung's concepts but explained them clearly, with concrete examples that made abstract ideas tangible. She told stories from her clinical work, shared her own experiences, drew on mythology and literature in ways that illuminated rather than obscured her points. Her writing was meant to be accessible, to reach not just other analysts, but ordinary people seeking understanding of their own psychological and spiritual journeys. This difference was not about one being smarter or more profound than the other. It was about different purposes and different gifts. Jung was creating a new field, establishing depth psychology as a discipline. This required the kind of systematic, scholarly writing that would be taken seriously by the academic and medical communities. Harding was bringing that field to life, showing how it could serve actual human suffering and transformation. This required writing that spoke to people's hearts as well as their minds. The accessibility of Harding's writing was particularly important for women. Jung's work could feel alienating, with its emphasis on concepts that seemed distant from daily life and its use of examples drawn primarily from male experience. Harding showed women how Jung's insights applied to their lives, how the archetypal patterns manifested in their actual experiences of menstruation, pregnancy, relationship, and aging. She made depth psychology feel relevant and practical rather than abstract and removed. This gift for translation, for making complex ideas accessible, was one of Harding's most significant contributions. She served as a bridge between Jung's systematic psychology and women's lived experience, showing how each illuminated the other. In doing so, she helped ensure that analytical psychology would not remain a specialist interest, but would become a resource for wider populations seeking to understand and transform their lives. Let us pause now and consider the overall shape of the relationship between Jung and Harding. At one level, It was clearly that of teacher and student. Jung provided the framework, the concepts, the systematic understanding of the psyche that made Harding's work possible. She honored him as teacher throughout her life, credited him consistently, saw herself as working within the tradition he established. But at another level, the relationship was more complex and reciprocal. Harding brought to analytical psychology insights and emphases that Jung himself had not fully articulated. She extended his work into territories he had mapped only sketchily. She questioned his assumptions, gently but persistently, especially regarding gender and embodiment. In doing so, she helped analytical psychology become more comprehensive, more adequate to the full range of human experience. Jung recognized this contribution, though perhaps not completely. He praised Harding's work and encouraged her explorations. He acknowledged that her perspective as a woman gave her access to aspects of feminine psychology he could only theorize about from the outside. Yet there remained a certain asymmetry in his understanding. He saw her as extending his work, filling in details, but not fundamentally revising or challenging it. Harding, for her part, was careful not to present herself as challenging Jung's authority. This was partly temperamental. She was not combative by nature, preferred dialogue to debate, but it was also strategic. As a woman in a field dominated by men, as someone without an academic position or institutional power, she could not afford to be seen as openly rebellious. Her influence had to come through example, through the quiet demonstration that her approach yielded insights Jung's did not. The result was a curious dynamic. On the surface, Harding appeared as Jung's faithful student, elaborating and applying his ideas. Beneath the surface, she was engaged in a subtle revision of his framework, one that honored his insights while expanding them to include what his masculine perspective had missed. This revision was all the more effective for being embedded in clinical work and accessible writing rather than stated as theoretical critique. This dynamic reflected a larger pattern in the history of thought, the way marginalized voices often have to work. Unable to claim authority directly, they must work obliquely, demonstrating through practice what they cannot assert through theory, making their revisions seem like extensions, claiming less than they are actually accomplishing. Harding's modesty about her own contributions, her consistent crediting of Jung, was partly genuine humility, but also partly necessity, the price of being heard. At all in a world that did not easily grant authority to women's voices, yet her influence was profound and lasting. Many of the women who trained with her went on to become significant figures in analytical psychology, carrying forward her emphasis on feminine psychology, embodiment, and spiritual practice. Her books continued to be read and to shape understanding of women's psychological development. And even when she was not directly cited, her insights filtered into the broader culture, shaping how women understood their own experiences. Contemporary Jungian psychology has largely absorbed Harding's insights without always acknowledging their source. The emphasis on embodiment, on the specificity of women's psychological development, on the importance of practice alongside interpretation, these are now widely accepted in analytical psychology. They seem like obvious aspects of the field rather than innovations that had to be fought for. This is perhaps the ultimate form of influence, when one's insights become so integrated into the tradition that they seem to have always been there. The conversation between Jung and Harding continues beyond their lifetimes in the ongoing development of depth psychology. Their dialogue raises questions that remain vital. How much does embodiment matter for psychological development? Are there fundamentally different masculine and feminine psychologies, Or are the archetypal patterns truly universal? What is the relationship between personal healing and social transformation? How do we balance systematic understanding with openness to the uniqueness of each individual's journey? These questions do not have simple answers, and different contemporary thinkers answer them differently. Some emphasize the universality of archetypal patterns, maintaining Jung's view that gender differences are primarily in how universal patterns manifest. Others follow Harding in insisting that embodiment creates fundamentally different psychological structures. Still others suggest that gender itself is more fluid and varied than either Jung or Harding recognized, that the masculine-feminine binary oversimplifies the complexity of human experience. What remains clear is that the questions Harding raised were necessary and important, that Jung's framework, for all its brilliance, needed the expansion and complication she provided. Depth psychology is richer and more adequate for their dialogue, for the way each illuminated what the other could not fully see. In the quiet hours of night, when consciousness softens and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows permeable, we might imagine Jung and Harding meeting again, no longer bound by the limitations of their historical moment. They walk together through a landscape that shifts between Swiss mountains and New York streets, between ancient temples and modern consulting rooms. They speak of what they now understand more fully, of what they missed in their earthly lives, of what their combined insights reveal about the human soul's nature and needs. Jung might acknowledge that his understanding of women's psychology was indeed incomplete, shaped by his masculine position in ways he could not fully transcend. He might recognize how Harding's attention to women's embodied experience revealed dimensions of the feminine archetype his more abstract approach had missed. He might appreciate the way she brought his concepts down to earth, made them practical and accessible, showed how they could serve actual transformation rather than just understanding. Harding might acknowledge that without Jung's systematic framework, her insights would have lacked the theoretical grounding that made them more than personal observations. She might recognize how his emphasis on the universal and archetypal prevented her work from becoming merely subjective, kept it connected to the larger patterns of human experience. She might appreciate his willingness to create a psychology that honored the soul, that recognized the reality of the numinous, even when this made him suspect in the scientific community. Together, they might recognize how their different perspectives complemented each other, how the masculine and feminine approaches they embodied created in their dialogue something more complete than either could achieve alone. They might see their relationship as itself an example of the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites that Jung saw as central to individuation, but enacted not within a single psyche but between two distinct individuals, each complete yet made more complete through encounter with the other's vision. This imagined dialogue points to something crucial about the nature of psychological understanding. No single perspective can capture the full complexity of the psyche. We need multiple viewpoints, different emphases, complementary approaches that illuminate different aspects of the whole. Jung's systematic, archetypal, universal psychology needed Harding's embodied, particular, practice-oriented approach. Her focus on women's specific experiences needed his framework of universal patterns. Together, they provide a more comprehensive understanding than either alone. This is why the conversation between great minds matters, why we linger over these dialogues and debates. Not because we seek a single correct theory, a final answer to the question of what the psyche is and how it works, but because in the space between different perspectives, in the creative tension of dialogue, we find a more adequate approximation of truth. Each thinker sees from their particular vantage point, and what they see is real, but there is always more to see, always another angle that reveals what the first angle obscured. The relationship between Jung and Harding demonstrates this beautifully. He saw the universal patterns. She saw the particular embodiments. He emphasized systematizing. She emphasized practicing. He valued the comprehensive map. She valued the responsive guide. Both were right, and both were incomplete without the other. Their dialogue, spanning decades of letters, books, and the training of students, enriched analytical psychology immeasurably. We can take from their dialogue several enduring lessons. First, that psychological understanding must honor both the universal and the particular, both the archetypal patterns that recur across cultures and the unique ways these patterns manifest in specific bodies, histories, and contexts. Second, that theory must remain connected to practice, that concepts are valuable only insofar as they serve actual healing and transformation. Third, that different perspectives, particularly those shaped by different positions in hierarchies of gender, race, class, culture, are not merely interesting variations, but are necessary for adequate understanding of the whole. Fourth, that intellectual humility is essential. Jung, for all his genius, had blind spots shaped by his masculine position and his cultural context. Recognizing this does not diminish his achievement but humanizes it, reminds us that all understanding is provisional and partial. Similarly, Harding had her own limitations, her own unexamined assumptions. She wrote primarily for and about white, educated, Western women. She did not adequately address how race, class, and culture complicated her understanding of feminine psychology. Fifth, that dialogue is more fruitful than debate. Jung and Harding did not primarily argue with each other. They explored together, each bringing their particular insights and questions to a shared project of understanding the psyche. This collaborative spirit allowed each to learn from the other without needing to prove the other wrong. Finally, that the work of understanding consciousness and facilitating transformation is never finished. Each generation must take up the questions anew, bringing its own perspectives and concerns, revising and extending what earlier thinkers established. Jung and Harding's dialogue is not a relic of the past, but a living conversation we can continue, taking up their insights and subjecting them to our own questioning, seeing what remains valuable and what needs revision in light of our own experience and concerns. As we drift now toward sleep, as consciousness releases its hold and the unconscious rises to meet us in dreams, we can carry with us the image of these two seekers. Jung with his fierce intellect and his willingness to venture into territories science had declared off-limits, Harding with her healing hands and her trust in embodied wisdom. They walked different paths to similar destinations, explored the same territories from different angles, and left us maps that, read together, provide a more adequate guide than either alone. The psyche they explored is our psyche. The archetypes they described are the patterns that shape our dreams and our longings. The individuation they theorized is the journey we are living, whether we name it or not. Their work is not about abstract concepts, but about the most intimate dimensions of our lives. How we become who we are, how we heal from wounds, how we find meaning, how we relate to the depths within us and to other human beings, how we participate in something larger than our small selves. May their dialogue continue in us, in our willingness to honor both the universal and the particular, both the systematic understanding and the lived experience. both the masculine and the feminine modes of knowing. May we take from Jung the courage to take the psyche seriously, to recognize that the inner world is as real and as worthy of exploration as the outer. May we take from Harding the insistence on embodiment, on practice, on the wisdom that comes not from theory alone, but from living through the descents and transformations she described. And may we continue the work they began, exploring the psyche with both rigor and reverence, with both analytical precision and openness to mystery, serving the healing and transformation that depth psychology at its best makes possible. For the work is not finished. The unconscious continues to speak in dreams and symptoms, in creativity and in crisis. The archetypes continue to move through human lives, shaping our stories and calling us toward wholeness. And we continue to need guides who can help us navigate these depths, who can offer both maps and companionship for the journey. In honoring Jung and Harding, we honor the long lineage of seekers who have devoted themselves to understanding the soul. They join the shamans and mystics, the priests and philosophers, the artists and healers who have recognized that human life involves dimensions beyond the material and the rational. They belong to the tradition of those who have dared to take seriously the invisible realm, to trust that the images that arise in dreams and visions carry meaning, to believe that consciousness itself is a mystery worth exploring. This tradition continues because the questions it addresses are perennial. How do we become whole? How do we integrate the divided aspects of self? How do we heal from wounds inflicted in childhood and carried through our lives? How do we find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless? How do we relate to the sacred, however we understand it? How do we live with integrity, aligned with our deepest truth? These are the questions Jung addressed through his elaborate map of the psyche, his theory of archetypes, his understanding of individuation. These are the questions Harding addressed through her attention to women's particular experiences, her integration of psychology and spirituality, her emphasis on embodied practice. Their answers differed in emphasis and focus, but both were responding to the same fundamental human needs for understanding, for wholeness, for transformation, for connection to something larger than ego consciousness. As sleep draws closer, as thought dissolves into image and image into darkness, we can rest in the knowledge that others have walked this path before us, have faced the same mysteries and struggles, have left us guidance for the journey. Jung and Harding are among our ancestors in the life of the soul, and their wisdom remains available to us, not as dogma to be followed, but as invitation to our own exploration. The conversation between them is our conversation between the systematic and the intuitive, between the universal and the particular, between the theoretical and the practical, between masculine and feminine modes of knowing. We carry on this conversation in our own lives, in our own attempts to understand and heal and become whole. And in doing so, we participate in the great ongoing project of human consciousness coming to know itself, of the soul exploring its own nature and potential. Sleep now, wanderer. Rest in the knowledge that the psyche knows its own path, that the unconscious is always moving toward consciousness, that the self seeks manifestation through our particular lives. Trust the process Jung mapped and Harding embodied. Trust the dreams that will come in the night, carrying messages from the depths. Trust that the journey toward wholeness continues, whether we are awake or asleep. That individuation is not a project we undertake, but a force that moves through us, seeking expression. And may you wake tomorrow with some small new insight, some intimation of the depths you carry, some sense of the larger patterns that shape your particular life. May Jung's vision of the collective unconscious and archetypal reality, and Harding's attention to embodied experience and feminine mystery both serve your own becoming. May their dialogue continue in you, helping you navigate your own descent and return, your own death and rebirth, your own journey toward wholeness. Rest now in the space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and not knowing, between the conscious mind's categories and the unconscious's wild wisdom. Here, in this liminal space, Jung and Harding meet again, and you meet them, and all who have ever sought to understand the soul's nature join in communion. We are all part of the same exploration, the same mystery, the same journey toward wholeness that is the deepest impulse of human life. Sleep and dream and wake to continue the journey. The work is never finished, but it is always held, always supported by those who have walked before us and those who walk beside us, and the great patterns that move through all human lives. You are part of this tradition now, part of the conversation between Jung and Harding and all who have sought to honor the soul. Carry their insights lightly. Use what serves your own journey, and add your own discoveries to the accumulated wisdom they have left us. The night deepens, and consciousness releases its hold. In this darkness, the unconscious stirs and dreams begin to form. May your dreams tonight carry messages from the depths, images of the archetypes Jung described and the goddesses Harding invoked, intimations of the wholeness you are becoming. May you wake tomorrow knowing something you did not know before, seeing something you had not seen, carrying forward the great work of consciousness coming to know itself. And may the dialogue between these two seekers of the soul continue to illuminate your path, showing you that there are many ways to approach the mystery of being human, that both the systematic understanding and the embodied wisdom have their place, that masculine and feminine modes of knowing complement and complete each other, that no single perspective captures the whole, but multiple perspectives together approximate the truth. Good night, wanderer. Rest well. The psyche watches over you while you sleep, doing its work of sorting and integrating and preparing the next day's consciousness. Trust this process. Trust the wisdom of the unconscious. Trust that you are held by patterns larger and older than yourself. And trust that tomorrow you will continue the journey, carrying forward what Jung and Harding have taught us, adding your own experience to the great collective exploration of what it means to be human. The story of Jung and Harding is your story too. Their dialogue is happening in you, between the parts of you that seek understanding and the parts that simply live, between your thinking and your feeling, between your conscious intentions and your unconscious depths. Honor this dialogue. Give it space. Let it unfold in its own time. And know that in doing so, you participate in something ancient and ongoing, the human soul's long conversation with itself about its own nature and potential and ultimate meaning. Sleep now, dream now, and wake tomorrow to continue the great work of becoming conscious, of healing the divisions within, of opening to the sacred dimensions of ordinary life. This is what Jung and Harding both devoted themselves to, each in their own way. And this is what they offer to us still, a vision of human life as sacred journey, of the psyche as mysterious depth, of wholeness as both birthright and task. May their vision guide and inspire your own journey toward whatever wholeness means for you in your particular life, with your particular wounds and gifts and questions. The night embraces you. The unconscious rises to meet your releasing consciousness, and somewhere beyond time and space, Jung and Harding continue their dialogue, continue their exploration, continue their service to the healing and transformation of the human soul. Rest in their legacy. Walk in their footsteps, and forge your own path, as they would have wanted, carrying their insights forward into new territory, making them your own, contributing your own discoveries to the great accumulated wisdom about what it means to be human and to seek wholeness in a fragmented world. Good night, seeker. Sleep well. And tomorrow, wake to continue the journey they began, and we all share the journey toward understanding and healing and transformation that is the deepest purpose of human life. Their work continues in you. Their dialogue lives on in your own attempts to integrate the divided aspects of yourself, to honor both thinking and feeling, to bring together the masculine and feminine modes of knowing, to serve the self that seeks expression through your unique life. This is their legacy. This is their gift. This is what they offer to us still. May we receive it gratefully and carry it forward faithfully, adding our own insights and discoveries, serving the great ongoing work of consciousness, exploring its own nature, and helping others make the same journey. Sleep now in this knowledge, rest in this tradition, and wake tomorrow ready to continue the work. The conversation between Jung and Harding, between masculine and feminine, between systematic understanding and embodied wisdom, continues in each of us who take up the questions they explored. May we do so with their courage, their integrity, and their devotion to the healing of the human soul.